The first shot rang out before Margaret Alden had even finished tying her horse to the post outside the Copper Creek Sheriff's office, and it told her everything she needed to know about the kind of town she had ridden into. Copper Creek, New Mexico Territory, sat in the flat basin between two red rock mesas like something the desert had forgotten to swallow. The year was 1883, and the railroad had only just kissed the edge of the territory, bringing with it all manner of people who smelled opportunity, the way vultures smelled something already dead. The town had a main street that stretched maybe 400 yards, a handful of timber-framed buildings that had weathered their share of sun and wind, and a population that was somewhere between desperate and dangerous at any given hour of the day. It was not the kind of place Margaret had planned to make her home, but plans, she had learned, were things you made before life decided it had better ideas. She was 26 years old, and she had come to Copper Creek alone, which was not something women of her standing were supposed to do. She had dark auburn hair that she kept pinned severely beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and her eyes were the color of good whiskey, amber and direct, the kind of eyes that made people feel she was reading them even when she was not. She wore a practical dark riding skirt, a white blouse slightly dusty from the road, and boots that had been expensive once and were merely serviceable now. She carried herself the way people carry themselves when they have learned not to wait for anyone's permission. Her father, Thomas Alden, had owned a modest cattle operation 40 miles north of Copper Creek. He had died 6 weeks prior, leaving her the deed to the land, a significant number of debts she had not known existed, and a single letter that explained none of it satisfactorily. She had come to Copper Creek to speak to his business partner, a man named Gerald Pratt, who held papers that either confirmed her ownership of the Alden land or signed it away to a creditor, depending on which version of events you chose to believe. It was a complicated situation, and it was her situation, and she intended to handle it herself. The second shot rang out as she stepped onto the boardwalk, and this one came with the sound of breaking glass from the saloon 3 doors down. She did not flinch. She simply stood straighter, tucked the leather satchel she carried more firmly under her arm, and pushed open the door to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Dale Whitmore was a man of 52 with a gray mustache that drooped like something defeated and eyes that had seen enough trouble to have grown permanently tired. He was standing behind his desk when she entered, already reaching for his hat, presumably to investigate the commotion outside. "I need a word with you, Sheriff," Margaret said. "Ma'am, there is currently a disturbance at the Golden Rail Saloon that requires my immediate—" "I will be brief," she said, and something in her tone made him pause with his hand still hovering over his hat. "My name is Margaret Alden. Thomas Alden was my father. He passed 6 weeks ago, and I have reason to believe that Gerald Pratt is in this town and is attempting to file false documentation regarding the Alden land grant. I need to know if you have a notary in this town, and whether the county recorder keeps records here or in Santa Fe." Sheriff Whitmore stared at her for a long moment. Then he sat back down. "County recorder is in Santa Fe, Miss Alden. We have a notary, that is Clarence Webb, who works out of the assay office on the east end of the street. And Gerald Pratt was indeed in this town yesterday, though I cannot speak to his current whereabouts." He paused. "Your father's passing was unfortunate. He was a decent man." "He was," she agreed, and she did not let the grief into her voice because there was no room for it just now. "I will be staying at whatever passes for a hotel in this town. If you hear anything from Pratt, I would be grateful if you sent word." "Miss Alden," the sheriff said, and he had the look of a man about to say something he considered helpful, "a woman traveling alone in this territory is not without certain risks. There are men in this town who—" "I appreciate the concern," she said, cutting him off with the kind of polite precision that was nevertheless absolutely final. "But I do not need protection, Sheriff. I need information. Good afternoon." She turned toward the door, and that was when she nearly walked directly into the chest of the man who had apparently been standing just outside it, leaning against the doorframe with his arms folded and his hat pulled low. He was not a tall man in the exaggerated sense that dime novels like to describe, but he was tall enough, and he was built with the kind of lean, unhurried solidity that came from years of actual work rather than performance. He wore a faded denim shirt, a vest the color of tobacco, and trail-worn trousers tucked into boots that had seen more ground than most men saw in a lifetime. His hat was dark brown and shaped by weather and habit rather than vanity. His face was tanned to a deep bronze, with a jaw that had not seen a razor in perhaps 3 days, and his eyes were a gray-green color that reminded Margaret, absurdly, of sage after rain. He looked at her with an expression that was neither challenging nor accommodating. He simply looked. "Excuse me," she said. He stepped aside without a word, holding the door open with one extended arm. She walked past him onto the boardwalk. Behind her, she heard the sheriff's voice say, "Yates, about that business at the Golden Rail," and then the door swung shut and she was already moving toward the eastern end of the street, toward the assay office, and she put the quiet-eyed stranger immediately out of her mind because she had more pressing things to attend to. The assay office was a narrow building that smelled of sulfur and old paper. Clarence Webb was a small, nervous man with ink-stained fingers and an air of perpetual apology, and he confirmed, with some relief, that no new filings regarding the Alden land had been made in Copper Creek that week. That was something, at least. It meant Pratt had not yet moved. It meant she still had time. She took a room at the Larimer Hotel, which was 4 rooms on the second floor of a general store, and was functionally adequate if not comfortable. She ate a quiet supper at the small restaurant across the street run by a woman named Rosa Castillo, who served excellent green chili stew and who did not ask questions, which Margaret appreciated. She returned to her room before dark, lit the single oil lamp, and spread the contents of her leather satchel across the bed. Her father's correspondence with Gerald Pratt went back 8 years. She had read it all a dozen times, and each time she read it she found something new to be troubled by. Pratt had been her father's business partner in a copper mining venture that had never produced much copper but had involved a great deal of paperwork. The land itself, the Alden land, had been her mother's originally, left to her by her own father, and passed to Thomas Alden upon his wife's death, and then to Margaret upon Thomas's. It was Margaret's by blood and by law. But Pratt had co-signed certain loans, and those loans had certain clauses. And those clauses were the kind of thing a dishonest man with a good lawyer could manipulate into something entirely different from what they had originally meant. She stayed up late and slept poorly and woke before dawn with the same tight feeling in her chest that had been there since she opened her father's last letter. She went downstairs and found, to her surprise, that Rosa Castillo's restaurant opened early and that there was coffee already made. She was the only customer at that hour except for one other, who was sitting at the far end of the counter with both hands wrapped around a mug, staring at nothing in particular. It was the man from the sheriff's office doorway. He did not acknowledge her. She sat at the near end of the counter and accepted the coffee Rosa poured for her, and she was aware in the peripheral, measured way that she was always aware of her surroundings, that he glanced at her once, and then returned to his study of the middle distance. Rosa brought her eggs and bread without being asked, which was the kind of intuitive hospitality that made Margaret feel, unexpectedly, a little less alone in a strange town. "That man," Margaret said quietly to Rosa, nodding almost imperceptibly toward the far end of the counter. "Do you know him?" Rosa glanced over with the easy familiarity of someone who knew everyone. "That is Arthur Yates," she said, equally quietly. "He has been in and out of this area for 2 years now. He works cattle drives, sometimes scouts for the ranches north of here. He is a decent man." She paused, considering. "Quiet. Is he trouble?" "No," Rosa said simply. "He is the opposite of trouble mostly, though trouble sometimes finds him anyway." Margaret considered this and then returned to her eggs. She had nearly finished when Arthur Yates set down his mug, dropped 2 coins on the counter with the casual accuracy of someone who has made the same gesture 1,000 times, and stood. He settled his hat on his head and walked to the door. Paused there, and without turning around he said, in a voice that was low and even and carried the particular deliberate quality of a man who did not speak unless he meant to, "The Pratt you are looking for took a room at the Kavanaugh boarding house on the south side of town last night. In case that is useful information." Margaret set down her fork. "How do you know who I am looking for?" "Sheriff Whitmore talks," he said, "and the walls in that office are thin." He opened the door. "Good morning, Miss Alden." He was gone before she could formulate a response that was neither grateful nor suspicious, which was the only kind she wanted to give him. She found Gerald Pratt at the Kavanaugh boarding house shortly after 9 in the morning. He was a man of 60, thick through the middle, with a florid complexion and the kind of confidence that came from decades of operating in spaces where the rules were less enforced than they were suggested. He wore a coat that had been expensive in some other decade, and a look of mild surprise when she appeared in the doorway of his rented room, which the landlady had opened after Margaret explained with complete composure that she was there on family legal business. "Margaret," he said, and his voice was warm in that particular way that contained no actual warmth. "You look like your mother." "The Alden deed," she said. "Where is it?" The conversation that followed was long and unpleasant. Pratt produced papers. She produced papers. They argued methodically and with increasing sharpness about the nature of the loan agreements, the co-signing arrangement, and what it did or did not entitle him to claim. He was, she discovered, not entirely without legal ground to stand on, which was the most frustrating part. He had a lawyer coming from Santa Fe, he said, who would be in Copper Creek by the following week. Until then, he suggested, she might want to consider a settlement. "I will not settle for what is already mine," she said. "Then we wait for the lawyer," he said, and smiled. She walked out. She walked the length of the main street twice, not because she was lost, but because she needed the movement to think clearly. The morning had grown warm, the way New Mexico mornings did, with a sudden intensity that was not hostile but demanded acknowledgement. The street had filled with its daily population, freight wagons and horses, and the particular mix of men who constituted the working reality of a Western territorial town in 1883. Cowboys from the surrounding ranches running errands, miners from the copper works east of town, a few Mexican families she recognized from the previous evening. The usual architecture of ordinary life that continued regardless of individual crisis. She was standing at the far end of the street, looking back toward the town with the uncomfortable sense of needing a plan, and not yet having a complete one, when someone came alongside her with the kind of unhurried steadiness that suggested he had been moving in the same direction for some time, rather than specifically seeking her out. "He will try to file before his lawyer arrives," Arthur Yates said, not looking at her, watching the street. "If the lawyer is coming for settlement talks, Pratt wants leverage first. He will file some kind of claim with Webb at the assay office to establish a record, even if it does not hold up. Having his name on a document matters more to his type than having his name on the right document." Margaret looked at him sideways. "You listened to a great deal of that conversation." "The boarding house walls are thinner than the sheriff's walls," he said, and there was something at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood. She studied him for a moment. He was looking at the street with that quiet, particular attention that she had noticed before, the kind that took in information without appearing to seek it. "Why do you care what happens to my land?" "I do not care about your land," he said, and then he did look at her, and his gray-green eyes were direct in a way that was neither aggressive nor evasive. "But you are in a town you do not know, and Pratt is the kind of man who does not stay in the legitimate arena once the legitimate arena stops working for him. I have seen his type before." He paused. "I have also been on the wrong side of men like him. Not as a woman alone in a strange town, but in the way that matters, which is the way where you know you are right and it almost does not help." She regarded him for another long moment. He did not fidget under it. He simply waited. "You are not here to protect me," she said. It was not a question exactly. "No," he said, "I am not." And then with that same almost not quite smile, "I thought I would just make myself useful if that is acceptable." Something in her chest shifted very slightly, like a door that had been closed for a long time moving just a fraction on its hinges. She chose to ignore it because she had other things to focus on, but she was honest enough with herself to notice it had happened. "Can you get me to Santa Fe faster than a lawyer can get from Santa Fe to here?" she asked. He considered. "The train from Lamy takes 2 days, but the stage to the rail connection is another day and a half from here. Pratt's lawyer is already in transit. You would not beat him." He paused. "But you could send a telegraph today to the county recorder's office in Santa Fe, formally registering your claim and requesting a hold on any new filings regarding the Alden land grant pending a legal dispute. That would accomplish the same thing as being there, and faster." She stared at him. "That is actually a very good suggestion." "The telegraph office is next to the post office on the north side of the street," he said. "Webb at the assay office can draft the formal language if you ask him. He is more competent than he appears." She turned and started walking. After 2 steps, she stopped and looked back at him. "What is your interest in this, Mr. Yates, truthfully?" He looked at her for a moment, and something moved behind those gray-green eyes that was more complicated than the question warranted. "Truthfully," he said, "I was leaving Copper Creek this morning. I had a job scouting for the Harmon Ranch north of here that starts in 3 days, and I was planning to ride out early and take the long way through the canyons." He paused. "I saw you walk into the sheriff's office yesterday, and I heard you tell Whitmore you did not need protection, and you were absolutely right that you did not. But it seemed to me that someone who was that right about something needed someone who was also going to be useful, and not in the protection sense." He said this last part with a plain simplicity that made it sound less like a compliment than a stated fact, which somehow made it more affecting than a compliment would have been. "So I stayed." She looked at him for a long time. He held her gaze without difficulty. "Thank you, Mr. Yates," she said finally, and it was genuine. "Arthur," he said. She turned back toward the street. "Thank you, Arthur." Clarence Webb at the assay office was, as advertised, more competent than he appeared, and he drafted the telegraph in clear and legally sound language in under 20 minutes. Margaret signed it, paid the telegraph operator $3.50 to send it with priority marking, and received a confirmation of transmission by noon. It was not a guarantee, but it was a record, and records mattered. She found Arthur at the livery stable in the early afternoon, where he was engaged in the unhurried, methodical work of checking the shoes on a roan quarter horse, with the kind of focused attention that told her he had been doing things like this his whole life. The horse was a beautiful animal, lean and well-muscled, with intelligent eyes that watched her approach with calm assessment. "The telegraph is sent," she told him. He straightened up, wiped his hands on his trousers. "Good. Webb do a proper job with the language. Better than proper. He knew the relevant sections of territorial property law better than I expected." She paused. "Have you been back to the sheriff's office today?" "Yes. Whitmore told me Pratt went to see Webb this morning, about an hour after you did. Webb told him there was a pending dispute on the Alden claim, and that he could not process any new filings against it pending notification from Santa Fe. Pratt left unhappy." She felt something loosen slightly in her shoulders. "Then we have bought time." "You have bought time," he corrected quietly, and it was not a small distinction, the way he said it. He was clear about whose victory it was. She noticed that. The afternoon had the long, golden quality that the New Mexico desert wore in late spring, the kind of light that made everything look like it was made of something more valuable than it actually was. They walked back from the livery stable together, not exactly side by side, because they had not yet established the kind of ease that allows for walking side by side without deliberation, but close enough that the distance between them was intentional rather than incidental. "Where are you from originally?" she asked, because they had walked half a block in silence and she found she wanted to know. Missouri, he said. A town that does not exist anymore, mostly. My family farmed there. He said this with the flat simplicity of someone who has described it this way many times and found that it covers the ground adequately. I came west at 19. That was 12 years ago. So you are 31. Yes. And you have been doing cattle work since then. Cattle work, scouting, some freighting. A year working with a land survey team in Arizona. He paused. I am not, as they say, a man with a plan. Neither am I most of the time, she said, which was honest. The plan usually comes to me after I have already started moving. He looked at her sideways, and there was genuine interest in his expression, the kind that is not performed. Is that how you ended up here? You started moving and the plan arrived. Something like that. She adjusted the satchel under her arm. My father died and there were these documents, and I knew that if I waited for someone to handle it, it would be handled wrongly. So I packed and I rode. She paused. My mother's people were from land-holding families in Virginia. The land was always important to her. I do not think I fully understood why until I was standing in my father's house looking at those papers and understanding what it would mean to lose it. Land that came from family is different from land you buy, he said. You can replace one but not the other. She looked at him. Exactly that. They had reached the front of the Larimer Hotel. The afternoon sun was beginning to angle west, painting the red dust of the street in deeper tones. Margaret stood for a moment on the boardwalk, and she was aware, quite precisely, that she had spent more of this day in company than she had in the past 6 weeks, and that it had not felt like an intrusion. I should go through the documents again tonight, she said. See if there is anything I missed. There is one other thing worth considering, Arthur said. He was standing at the edge of the boardwalk, one hand resting on the post, looking at the street. Pratt will not wait quietly until his lawyer arrives if he thinks you have already established a legal record. He is the kind of man who makes things complicated when the straightforward route closes. I would expect him to look for another angle, such as finding someone in this town who knew your father and who might be willing to sign an affidavit about the state of Thomas Alden's mind in his last months. A competency challenge would not invalidate the deed, but it would delay things long enough to be useful to him. Margaret was quiet for a moment. My father was of perfectly sound mind. I know, but I also know that men like Pratt do not need the truth to be useful. They need it to be debatable. He looked at her directly. Is there anyone in this town who knew your father well? Someone who would speak on his behalf if asked, she thought. Sheriff Whitmore said he was a decent man. They knew each other. Whitmore is honest, Arthur said. If you ask him formally, he will say in writing what he believes to be true. That is worth having. She looked at him again with that amber-eyed directness that she was not entirely aware she used, the kind of look that simply arrived on her face when she was paying full attention. You have done this kind of thing before, she said. This kind of legal navigation, property disputes. Something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. My father lost our land, he said, to a man who knew the law better than he did. That was 1870. I was 18. He said it plainly without drama, but there was an entire history in the flatness of the telling. I learned after that to know the law better than the men who try to use it as a weapon. Margaret was quiet for a moment. She felt the full weight of what he had said, not just the words but the years behind them, the specific texture of a loss that could not be recovered. I am sorry, she said, and she meant it entirely without qualification. It was a long time ago, he said, and then, with the smallest and most genuine smile she had yet seen on his face, it is useful now. She went upstairs and spent the evening at the small writing table in her room, working through documents and making notes in the margins of her father's correspondence. The oil lamp made a warm circle of light on the papers, and outside the window the desert night was settling in with its particular vastness, and its stars that were too numerous to count and too bright to ignore. She found herself, more than once, aware that somewhere in this same small town Arthur Yates was also awake, probably perhaps at a table in whatever lodging he had, perhaps thinking about something entirely different, perhaps thinking about Missouri and farms and losses from when he was 18. She did not know why she found herself thinking about where he was or what he was thinking. She put it down to the unusualness of having an ally, which was something she was not accustomed to, and which created a certain orientation of attention that was reasonable and did not require further analysis. She went to see Sheriff Whitmore the next morning before breakfast. He was more amenable than she had expected, once she explained what she needed. He had known Thomas Alden for 11 years, he said, and would put in writing that Thomas Alden had been, in his direct and consistent observation, fully sound of mind and body until within 2 weeks of his death from a heart ailment, and that in those 2 weeks he had been physically weakened but not cognitively diminished. He wrote this out in his own hand, signed it, and had his deputy witness the signature. "Your father spoke about you often," Whitmore said, as he folded the document and handed it to her. "He was very proud. He always said you had more sense than most men he knew." She took the paper and did not let her voice unsteady. "Thank you, Sheriff." "The young man who suggested this, I assume," he said, not quite a question. She did not answer that directly. "Good morning, Sheriff." Outside on the boardwalk she found Arthur waiting, not obtrusively, just present the way he seemed to make himself present, leaning against the post with his hat tilted forward against the morning sun and a look of contained patience on his face. She held up the document. He nodded once, the kind of nod that acknowledged good news without making it a performance. "Coffee?" he said. "Yes," she said. They went to Rosa Castillo's restaurant, and this time they sat at the same section of the counter without deliberation, which was the kind of small social shift that is noticeable only in retrospect but is nonetheless significant. Rosa brought coffee and corn cakes and did not comment on anything, which was a form of tact that Margaret appreciated. "Tell me about the land," Arthur said, after they had been sitting in comfortable silence for a moment. "What is it like?" She looked at him. He was looking at his coffee. The question was genuine. "It is 40 miles north of here, up in the foothills where the desert starts to think about becoming something else. Pinon and juniper mostly. The grass is good in wet years. There is a creek that runs east of the house, not large but reliable." She paused. "My mother used to say it was the most beautiful place she had ever seen, and she had been to places that should have been more beautiful, so that meant something." "How large?" 1,100 acres. The cattle operation is small, maybe 120 head. My father had a foreman, a man named Diego Sanchez, who has been keeping things running." She paused. "I need to get back to it within the month. Diego cannot manage indefinitely on the arrangement my father had, which was more informal than it should have been." "You plan to run it yourself?" "I do," she said, without hesitation. He looked at her then, and there was something in his expression that was neither doubting nor flattering, that particular middle territory of simply taking seriously what he was hearing. "You know cattle work." "I know enough. I grew up working beside my father. I am a better rider than most people I have met, and I learned fast." She met his gaze. "I know what you are not asking, which is whether a woman alone can manage a cattle operation in this territory, and the answer is yes, if she is competent and not afraid of hard work." "I was not actually about to ask that," he said. "Most men would." "I am aware," he said, and something in his tone suggested he found it genuinely absurd that they would. "I have met enough incompetent men in this territory to know that competence is distributed without reference to who is carrying it." She looked at him for a moment longer than she intended. "You are an unusual man, Arthur Yates." "So I have been told," he said, and the corner of his mouth curved. "Usually not as a compliment." "It is today," she said, and then she looked back at her coffee, and there was warmth in her face that the morning air had not put there. The trouble came that afternoon, as troubles in Copper Creek tended to, during the quiet hours when the heat was highest and attention naturally slackened. Margaret was at the assay office with Webb, reviewing the confirmation that had come back by telegraph from Santa Fe, which officially logged the dispute hold on the Alden land filings, when the door opened and Gerald Pratt came in with a man she did not know, a compact, cold-eyed man in a city suit who announced himself as Pratt's legal counsel, Henry Marsh, arrived early from Santa Fe. Marsh was exactly what she had feared, which was a very good lawyer. He was perhaps 50, thin-lipped and precise, with the careful enunciation of someone who had spent decades making language do exactly what he wanted it to do. He examined her documents with the kind of attention that was simultaneously respectful and predatory, turning each page as if looking for the place where it became less than it claimed to be. She held her ground. She had Webb beside her, and she had the telegraph confirmation from Santa Fe, and she had Whitmore's affidavit, and she had her father's original deed, which she had never let leave her possession, folded and sealed in oilskin in the deepest pocket of her satchel. The dispute hold is legitimate, Marsh acknowledged, which was not a concession but a tactical acknowledgement. However, the question of the co-signature loan agreement and its implications for the title remains unresolved. Mr. Pratt is prepared to offer Miss Alden a settlement of $300 and clear title to the house structure, while the land itself transfers to satisfy the debt obligation. "No," Margaret said. "Miss Alden, the legal picture is—" "The legal picture," she said, with the precision of someone who had spent 3 nights reading documents, "is that my father co-signed a loan from Pratt's mining company to the land operation, not the other way around. The collateral was listed as equipment and cattle, not land. The deed is not encumbered. I have the original signed loan document, and it does not say what Mr. Pratt would like it to say." Marsh paused for a fraction of a second, which was more than she had expected. "May I see that document?" She produced it. He read it. His expression did not change outwardly, but something shifted in the quality of his attention. Pratt said behind Marsh, "The subsequent amendment—" "There is no subsequent amendment signed by my father," Margaret said. "There is a document that purports to be an amendment which Mr. Pratt has been circulating, but which was signed only by Mr. Pratt and which does not bear my father's signature or any notarial seal issued in the territory of New Mexico." She paused. "I would be very interested to know, Mr. Marsh, whether your client showed you the complete document history before you came from Santa Fe." Marsh turned and looked at Pratt. The look was brief but surgical. Pratt's florid complexion had taken on a slightly uneven quality. "I think," Marsh said after a moment, "that it would be best to have a full documentation review before proceeding further. Mr. Pratt, I will need to speak with you privately." He turned back to Margaret. "Miss Alden, this may not conclude today." "That is fine," she said. "I am not going anywhere." Marsh and Pratt left. Webb let out a long breath. Margaret stood very still for a moment, and she realized her hands were shaking very slightly, not from fear but from the specific physical aftermath of intense concentration combined with the effort of remaining composed. She walked out of the assay office into the afternoon brightness, and Arthur was there, across the street, leaning against the wall of the post office in the shade, and she did not ask herself why she was not surprised to see him there. She crossed the street and stood beside him. "It went well," he said. "It was not a question. He did not expect me to have the original loan document," she said. Marsh did not know the case was as thin as it is. "I think Pratt has been selectively presenting the evidence." She paused. "Marsh is a good lawyer. He will not attach his name to a fraud once he understands what it is. That is actually good for me, strange as that sounds." "Ethical lawyers are useful in these situations," Arthur agreed. She leaned her shoulder against the wall beside him because she was tired and the wall was there, and he was simply a presence that did not require management. This might actually resolve within a few days if Marsh reviews the full documentation and advises Pratt to let it go. "What will you do when it does?" "Ride north and go home," she said. "There is a cattle operation that needs managing." He was quiet for a moment, and she was quiet beside him, and the afternoon street moved past them with its horses and its dust and its ordinary business. A child chased a dog past them, both of them ignoring the heat with the specific immunity of the young. A woman in a blue calico dress came out of the dry goods store carrying a basket. Two cowboys rode past at a walk, talking about something that made one of them laugh suddenly, the sound carrying clean and clear in the dry air. "I have a job starting in 3 days," Arthur said. "You mentioned scouting for the Harmon Ranch." "Yes," he paused. "Harmon Ranch is 30 miles north of the Alden land." She turned her head and looked at him. He was still looking at the street. "Is it?" she said. "It is a 3-month contract," he said, "after which I will be without a contract, as I generally am." "And what do you generally do in that situation?" "Look for the next thing," he said. And finally he looked at her, and the gray-green of his eyes in the afternoon light had that quality of sage after rain again, which she had noticed the first day, and which she noticed now with considerably more attention. Sometimes the next thing comes looking. She held his gaze and felt that small door in her chest open another fraction, and this time she did not entirely choose to ignore it, though she did not know what to do with it either. She had been so completely focused for so many weeks, so entirely oriented toward the practical and the necessary, that the arrival of something warm and unruly, and not at all practical, felt strange in a way that was, unexpectedly, not entirely unwelcome. "That would depend," she said, choosing her words with care, "on what the next thing is looking for." The corner of his mouth moved. "I imagine it would." They stayed there for another few minutes in that particular quiet that is not the absence of communication but a form of it. And then the afternoon began to move toward evening, and they both had things to return to. And they went their separate ways without making plans, because neither of them was, as it turned out, primarily a person who made plans. Henry Marsh came to the assay office the following morning and spent 4 hours reviewing documents with Clarence Webb acting as neutral party and Margaret present throughout, methodical and attentive, and absolutely unyielding on the specifics she knew to be solid. By noon, Marsh had assembled a picture that was sufficiently clear to him, and he sent for Gerald Pratt, who arrived looking like a man who had not slept well and had been thinking about why. The conversation was not comfortable. Pratt argued, but with declining conviction, the specific deflation of a man watching leverage evaporate. Marsh was, as Margaret had predicted, an ethical enough lawyer not to want his name on something demonstrably false, and he was clear-eyed enough to understand what the original loan document meant for the case. By 2 o'clock, Gerald Pratt signed an acknowledgment that the Alden land deed was unencumbered and that the loan collateral did not extend to the title. Webb notarized it. Margaret signed the copy. Marsh folded his papers with the equanimity of a professional who had been on the wrong side of a case before and had survived it, and he said, quietly and without particular warmth but without malice either, "Your father raised you well, Miss Alden." "He did," she said. She walked out of the assay office with the signed document in her satchel, and the afternoon sunlight fell on her like something that had been held back and now released, and she stood on the boardwalk and breathed in the warm, pinyon-scented air and felt, for the first time in 6 weeks, that the tightness in her chest had eased completely. She found Arthur at the livery stable again, this time in conversation with the livery keeper about something involving a horseshoe nail, a conversation that he concluded before he turned and saw her face and apparently read everything in it immediately. "Done," he said. "Done," she said, and her voice had something in it that she did not try to regulate, a warmth and a relief and a joy that had nowhere else to go. He smiled at that, fully and without reservation, and it was the first time she had seen his face entirely unguarded, and it transformed him in a way that was almost startling, making him look younger and less careful and entirely, specifically himself. It was a very good smile. She thought, objectively, that it was one of the better smiles she had encountered. "We should celebrate," he said. "I have not celebrated anything in a long time," she said. "What does one do to celebrate in Copper Creek?" Rosa makes something called arroz con pollo that she only puts on the menu when she feels like it, he said. And there is a porch behind the restaurant where you can eat it and look at the canyon wall when the sun sets on it. He paused. The canyon wall turns the color of old copper at sunset. It is worth seeing. That sounds, she said, like a perfect way to celebrate. Rosa did, in fact, feel like making the arroz con pollo that evening, and she set 2 plates on the small porch behind the restaurant without comment, with the instinctive grace of someone who understands what is in front of her and chooses to honor it. The canyon wall to the west did exactly what Arthur had said it would, catching the setting sun and going through stages of amber and deep orange, and a final, extraordinary shade of red copper that made the stone look like something alive. They ate and talked, and this time the conversation moved without the practical framework of property disputes and legal strategy, moving instead through the things that people share when the immediate pressure has lifted, and they discover they are interested in each other for reasons beyond the immediate pressure. He told her about the survey work in Arizona, about the strange and specific beauty of that desert and the Navajo families he had met in the course of the work, about a night spent on a mesa watching a lightning storm move across a plain 50 miles wide and feeling, in a way he had not felt since Missouri, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. She told him about her mother, who had been a woman of considerable learning and unconventional independence for her time, who had read law books for recreation and taught Margaret the same, who had died of a fever when Margaret was 14, and had left in her the particular combination of self-sufficiency and loneliness that she had carried as a private landscape ever since. "She sounds remarkable," Arthur said. "She was," Margaret said. "She would have liked you, I think." She had no patience for men who were intimidated by competent women, and you do not appear to suffer from that particular condition. "I genuinely cannot see the appeal of finding competence threatening," he said. "Though I am told it is common." "Extremely," she said dryly. He laughed and she laughed with him, and the canyon wall went from copper to violet to the deep blue of full evening, and the first stars came out over the desert, and neither of them was in a hurry to be anywhere else. "I have been thinking about something," she said, when the laughter had settled back into the comfortable quiet. She was holding her coffee cup in both hands, looking at the darkened canyon. "The Alden land is 1,100 acres. There is good grazing in the north section that has been underused because my father did not have the crew to run it properly. If the operation expanded, even modestly, it would support more hands, more capacity." She paused. "I have been thinking about what kind of manager I need. Someone who knows cattle work, knows the territory, knows how to scout for water and grazing and trouble before it becomes more than trouble." Arthur was very still in the way that he was still when he was paying full attention. "Diego Sanchez is an excellent foreman," she continued. "He knows the land and he knows cattle, but he is a foreman. He is not a," she paused, choosing the word carefully, "a partner in the operational sense. Someone who can take a section of the work entirely and own it so that it gets done whether I am there or not." "That is not a job you would advertise at a livery stable," Arthur said. "No," she agreed. "It is not." He turned and looked at her in the starlight, and the gray-green of his eyes was darker now, and the expression in them was something she had not seen directed at her before, which was the look of a man who is being genuinely, completely surprised by something he had not allowed himself to anticipate. "Margaret," he said, "I am not asking you to make a decision tonight," she said. "I am telling you what I have been thinking about. Because it occurs to me that you are a man without a plan, and I am a woman with land and a purpose, and sometimes those two things are useful to each other in ways that go beyond the practical." "That is possibly the most carefully worded thing anyone has ever said to me," he said. "I can be less careful," she said, "but I thought I would start there." He looked at her for a long moment. "You have known me for 2 days." "I know," she said. "But I am, as you may have gathered, a person who starts moving before the plan arrives. The plan has been arriving in stages." She paused. "You stayed when you did not have to." You helped with knowledge, not strength, because you understood that strength was not what was needed. You did not tell me what to do once, not once." She held his gaze. "In my experience, that is worth more than a long acquaintance." He was quiet, and she let the quiet be, because she had said what she needed to say, and she was not in the habit of filling silence with apology. "The Harmon Ranch job," he said. "Has an end date," she said. He looked down at his hands, then back at her, and there was something warm and unguarded in his face that she was beginning to recognize as the look he carried when he had stopped managing his own expression. "I have been moving through this territory for 12 years, he said. "Jobs that end in 3 months, and then the next thing, and then the next. I have been good at it. I am not sure I have been happy at it in the deep and quiet sense." He paused. "I noticed you walking into that sheriff's office, and I thought, here is someone who knows exactly who she is and what she is doing. I stayed because—" He stopped and then tried again. "I stayed because being near someone who knows that clearly what she is and what she is doing makes a person want to know that about themselves." It was possibly the most honest thing she had heard anyone say in a very long time. "Do you know what you are and what you are doing?" she asked quietly. "I think," he said, "I am beginning to." They sat on that porch until the night was fully committed, and the stars were scattered in their impossible profusion across the New Mexico sky, and they talked, and they were quiet, and they talked again. And at some point during all of this, the distance between them on the rough wooden bench had decreased without deliberation to the kind of distance that only exists between people who have stopped managing it. And when Margaret looked at her hands, she found that at some point during the evening his had covered them. And she had not only not objected, but had turned her palm up to receive it. He walked her back to the Larimer Hotel through the quiet street, and they stood outside in the warm night air, and she looked at him and he looked at her, and there was nothing uncertain about what was between them, only the question of what to do with it and when. "Come north when the Harmon job finishes," she said. "Come and see the land." "I will," he said. It was not a polite agreement. It was a statement of fact. "Good," she said. He stood for a moment more, and then, with a care and a deliberateness that was entirely characteristic of him, he raised her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and it was old-fashioned and it was genuine, and it sent warmth up her arm and through her chest to a place she had not felt warm in a very long time. "Good night, Margaret," he said. "Good night, Arthur," she said. She went upstairs and sat at the writing table for a long time without opening any documents, simply looking at the oil lamp and listening to the desert and feeling the particular quality of something beginning. She left Copper Creek the next morning. She went to Rosa's restaurant first and ate breakfast, and Rosa packed her a cloth bundle of food for the road without being asked, and when Margaret tried to pay for it, Rosa shook her head and said, "Come back through someday." She stopped at the sheriff's office and gave Whitmore a copy of the signed acknowledgment from Pratt, so there was a record in Copper Creek. Whitmore read it and nodded with the satisfaction of a man who prefers things to come out fairly. "The Yates boy rode out early," he offered, in the careful tone of someone providing information that has not been asked for. "He has a job at the Harmon Ranch," Margaret said. "He does," Whitmore agreed. "Good man." "I know," she said, and the warmth in her voice was not entirely concealed. She rode north out of Copper Creek with her satchel on her back, and the deed to her land safe in oilskin, and the morning sun coming up strong and golden over the mesa to her east. And she felt, riding through the red rock country with the pinon and juniper beginning to appear on the hillsides, that the tightness that had been in her for 6 weeks was entirely gone, replaced by something that was both lighter and more substantial, if that was possible. She felt like herself completely, for the first time since her father died. She arrived at the Alden land in the early evening of the second day of riding, and Diego Sanchez, who was a man of 50 with a face carved by weather and a dignity that needed no ceremony, came out of the barn when he heard the horse and looked at her face and said simply, "It is resolved." "It is resolved," she said. He nodded once, the same kind of nod Arthur had given when she held up the Whitmore document. She thought, with a quiet internal amusement, that good men had a common economy of expression when things had gone right. She settled back into the land over the following weeks with the same deliberate attention she brought to everything. She reviewed the financial situation completely, which was not as dire as she had feared, partly because Diego had been managing with a careful frugality, and partly because the cattle had done well through the winter. She made arrangements with a banker in the nearest town to consolidate the remaining debts at a fixed rate, which was more manageable than the arrangement her father had maintained. She hired 2 additional hands on Diego's recommendation, both young men from the local area who knew the country and were willing workers. She wrote to Arthur twice during this period, to the Harmon Ranch, because she had his address from the job he had mentioned. The first letter was brief and informational, telling him the land situation, the cattle count, the progress on the debt arrangement. The second letter was longer and less informational, and more honest about certain things she found herself thinking about in the evenings when the day's work was done, and the house was quiet, and the creek ran its quiet business outside the window. His letters came back in the same order, brief and informational first, then longer, then considerably longer, with a quality of writing that surprised her, and then did not, because he was a man who had been living in his own company for a long time and had thoughts that had accumulated without a recipient. He wrote about the Harmon Ranch country and the work of scouting, which he did with an efficient intelligence that the Harmon foreman clearly valued. He wrote about the landscape, the particular way a canyon looked at midday versus evening, the behavior of cattle in summer heat, the stars over the mesa at night. He wrote about a conversation he had had with an old Mescalero Apache man who lived at the edge of the Harmon Range, and who had said something about land and belonging that Arthur had been thinking about since. He wrote, in the last letter before the 3-month contract ended, that he had been thinking about what she had said on the porch behind Rose's restaurant, and that he had been thinking about it at some length, and that thinking about it had clarified certain things he had not previously been clear about, chief among them being that he had not been simply useful to her in Copper Creek, though he hoped he had been useful, but that he had also been, for the first time in a long time, entirely himself. And that this seemed significant. She read that last letter 3 times and then sat with it folded in her hands for a while, looking at the creek through the window, which was catching the late afternoon light the way her father had always said it did, with a particular silver quality that meant the day had been good. He arrived in the first week of October, on a Tuesday, which was the kind of detail that seemed insignificant and was not. She had known, because his last letter had said he would be done at Harmon's by the end of September, and she had known, because she knew him in the way that one sometimes knows people who are essential, that he would not delay unnecessarily. She was in the south pasture checking on a section of fence that Diego had reported needed attention when she saw the roan quarter horse coming up the trail from the south, and the figure on it, lean and unhurried, with a dark brown hat and a vest the color of tobacco, and she stood in the pasture with her work gloves in her hand and felt something that was too large for the moment and exactly right for it. He came down the slope and through the gate she had left open, and he rode up to where she was standing and stopped, and looked down at her from the horse with those gray-green eyes that the autumn light made look like the desert after rain, and he said, "You have good land." "I know," she said. "The creek is something," he said. "It is." He swung down from the horse and stood on the ground in front of her, and they were close, the way they had been close on the bench behind Rose's restaurant, and his expression had that fully unguarded quality that she had seen first on that day in the livery stable when she had told him it was done. "I have been thinking," he said. "So have I," she said. "Do you want to hear what I have been thinking?" "I believe I already know most of it," she said. "But yes." He smiled, that full unheld smile that she had been carrying the memory of for 3 months, and he said, "I want to stay, Margaret. Not because I do not have somewhere else to go, but because I want to be here specifically. On this land, with you. Not as a hired hand and not as a convenience, but as he paused, looking for the word, as someone who intends to be where you are. She looked at him for a long moment, and her heart was doing something that was not its usual measured business, and she said, I intend to be where I am for the rest of my life. This land is mine, and I am going to build something on it. It will be hard work, and there will be bad years and good years, and the isolation of this territory is not for everyone. I have been moving for 12 years, he said. I am not afraid of staying. Then stay, she said. It was the simplest and most complete thing she had said in a very long time. He reached out and tucked a strand of her wind-loosened hair back from her face, and his hand stayed there at her jaw, and she leaned into it fractionally, and he kissed her, quietly and with care, and with a depth that contained everything they had said to each other and a few things they had not yet said. And the October sun came down warm on the south pasture, and the creek ran its silver business in the near distance, and the cattle moved in the far field with the unhurried drift of animals that know they are home. Diego Sanchez, who was mending fence 30 yards away, and had the discretion of a man who has seen enough of life to understand when he is not the important part of it, continued mending fence without looking up. They were married in December, in the small church in the nearest town, which was called Tierra Dulce, and sat 12 miles west of the Alden land at the junction of two roads, and had a priest who doubled as a school teacher, and who performed the ceremony with the practical dignity of someone who had been doing useful work for many years, and took it seriously. Rosa Castillo made the journey from Copper Creek, which was 40 miles and took 2 days, and brought a covered dish and a bottle of wine from her personal stores, and cried in the way that people cry when something turns out right. Sheriff Whitmore sent a letter of congratulations that arrived 3 days after the wedding, which was the nature of mail in the territory in 1883, but was no less warm for the delay. Diego gave Margaret his late mother's silver hair comb to wear, which was the most moving gesture she had received in memory, and she wore it without making a scene about it, which he appreciated, because he was not a man for scenes. Arthur wore a shirt that was cleaner than usual, and looked at Margaret walking toward him in the church with an expression that would have embarrassed him if he had known what it looked like, which was a man in possession of everything he had not let himself want for 12 years. They said their vows with the direct simplicity of two people who mean every word they say. The winter that year was cold and specific, the kind of cold that makes a house important, and the Alden house, which was stone and adobe and had been built by Margaret's grandfather on her mother's side with the intention of enduring, was warm and solid and sufficient. They spent the winter evenings at the table by the fire, Arthur reviewing the cattle records and learning the land the way he learned everything, which was thoroughly and without hurry, and Margaret working on the financial plans and the spring expansion she had been mapping since October. They talked constantly, in the way that people talk when they have been solitary for a long time and have found the right person to talk to. And they were also sometimes quietly together without talking, and both were equally necessary. She told him about her mother in the long evenings with more detail than she had told anyone, about the woman who had read law books and ridden horses, and believed that a woman's intelligence was not a handicap to be managed but a force to be used. Arthur listened in the way that he listened to everything, fully and without interruption, and he said, after one of these evenings, "Your mother is partly why you were able to win in Copper Creek." "She is entirely why," Margaret agreed. "She taught me the law. She told me that the law could be used against you or by you, and the only question was whether you learned it first." "Smart woman," he said. "The smartest I ever knew," Margaret said. "Until I met Rosa Castillo, possibly." He laughed at that. She loved his laugh by now with the specific love one develops for the particular sounds a person makes when they are entirely themselves. The spring brought the first cattle drive that Arthur helped plan and execute, a modest push of 50 head to a buyer in Santa Fe, which was the first time the Alden operation had sold directly to a Santa Fe buyer rather than going through an intermediary, which improved the margin considerably. The drive took 12 days, and he came back from it with the particular satisfied weariness of a man who has done good work. And she met him at the gate, and he swung down, and she was in his arms before he had quite finished the motion. And Diego looked at the sky with the expression of a man considering meteorological phenomena. The second winter, she told him, quietly, on a cold November evening by the fire, that she was expecting their first child. He went very still in the way he went still when something required his complete attention. Then he reached across and took her hand and held it for a long time without saying anything, which was exactly the right thing to do, and then he said, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "Good," he said. He squeezed her hand. "Good." The child was born in June of 1885, a boy they named Thomas William Yates, Thomas for her father and William for Arthur's, two men who had each lost something that their son would not lose. He was born in the stone and adobe house with the creek running outside the window, in the early morning when the light was silver and precise, and he was loud from the first moment in the way that suggested he had opinions, and intended to express them at full volume. And Arthur held him with the careful, wondering expression of a man holding something that exceeds his categories. And Margaret looked at the two of them, and felt the fullness of it settle into her bones like something permanent. Thomas William grew into a strong, curious, noisy child who was on a horse by the time he was 3, and who had, by 4, already demonstrated that he had inherited his mother's directness and his father's quiet attention to detail, which was a formidable combination, and which Diego observed with a private satisfaction he would never have articulated aloud. In the summer of 1887, they expanded the north section of the Alden land as Margaret had been planning since the beginning, leasing an additional 400 acres adjacent to the original grant, and running cattle on it under a new arrangement with Diego, who was given a formal foreman's contract and a share of the northern section's profits, which was the least he was owed, and which he accepted with a dignity that made the formality worthwhile. Rosa Castillo came to visit that September and spent 2 weeks at the Alden ranch, cooking things that improved everyone's life. And she and Margaret sat on the porch in the evenings and talked about everything and nothing in the way that women who are genuine friends talk when they finally have time to do it. Rosa had, in the years since 1883, expanded her restaurant to include a second room and had hired 2 additional people, and had a reputation in Copper Creek and beyond for the best food in the territory, which she accepted with characteristic lack of fanfare. "He is good," Rosa said one evening, watching Arthur and Diego moving cattle across the near field, their figures small and efficient in the late light. "He is," Margaret said. "You were right not to need protection," Rosa said, and she was smiling. "I was right that I did not need protection," Margaret agreed. "What I needed, it turned out, was a peer, which is a different thing entirely." "Very different," Rosa agreed. "Much harder to find." "Considerably," Margaret said, "but worth finding." In the spring of 1888, their second child arrived, a girl they named Clara Rosa Yates, the Rosa for the obvious reason, which made the recipient of the name cry in a way that she had not cried since 1883, and which she denied with complete conviction afterward. Clara Rosa was a quieter child than her brother, with her father's gray-green eyes and a contemplative quality that suggested she was processing a great deal before she decided to say anything about it, which made her parents exchange glances of private recognition. Thomas William was 3 by then, and greeted his sister with the combination of enthusiasm and bewilderment appropriate to the occasion, and very quickly developed the protective older brother instinct that would characterize him for the rest of his life, which his sister would spend an equal amount of time being grateful for and exasperated by. The land continued to grow in the way that land grows when it is tended by people who understand it and respect it. The operation in 1888 was considerably larger and more profitable than it had been in 1883, running nearly 300 head on the original grant and the least northern section, with 3 permanent hands besides Diego and seasonal help for the drives. Margaret managed the financial side with the precision that her mother's law books and her own native intelligence had given her, and Arthur managed the cattle side with the complete competence of a man who had spent 12 years learning every aspect of this work from the ground up. And together, they made something that was better than either would have made alone, which is the best version of what a partnership can be. She sometimes thought about Copper Creek, about the particular sequence of days in May of 1883 that had changed the direction of her life. She thought about walking into that sheriff's office with the certainty that what she needed was information and not protection, and the stranger in the doorway who had apparently understood that from the first moment and chosen to respond to it accordingly. She thought, occasionally, about what would have happened if she had been a different kind of woman, one who had accepted the protection the sheriff offered, who had waited for someone else to manage the situation. Pratt would have filed his false claim, probably. The land would have been in legal dispute for years. She might have won eventually, or she might not have. She thought about this not with the anxiety of the alternative, but with a gratitude for the actual sequence, which was that she had known what she needed, and she had known how to get it, and she had been unafraid to do both. And somewhere in the mechanics of that, the universe had produced Arthur Yates leaning against a doorframe with his hat pulled low, deciding without anyone asking him to that he would stay and be useful in the specific way that was actually needed. There was an evening in the autumn of 1888, when Thomas William was 3 and Clara Rosa was several months old, and the land was deep in the particular gold of a New Mexico fall, when Margaret and Arthur sat on the porch of the stone and adobe house as the sun went down over the western mesa, and watched the light do what the light did in that country, which was extraordinary and daily, and never something you quite got used to. Clara Rosa was asleep inside, and Thomas William was sitting on the porch step building something with sticks that had an architectural ambition exceeding its structural reality. And Diego had gone to his own quarters after the day's work, and the cattle were settled in the field, and the creek was running its silver run in the near quiet, and there was no outstanding problem in the world that required immediate attention. Margaret had her head on Arthur's shoulder, which was something she had arrived at gradually over the years in the way that one arrives at the things that feel most completely right, which is slowly, and then entirely. His arm was around her, and he was looking at the mesa, and his face had that quality of peace that she had come to know as the deepest version of him, the one that existed when all the movement had stopped and there was simply this. "I have been thinking about something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "The eastern section of the creek land past the juniper stand," she said. "I think it could support an additional paddock. If we ran a breeding program rather than just drives, we could stabilize the income between the cattle sale years." She paused. "Diego thinks it is viable. I have been working up the numbers." He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel through his shoulder the small internal shift that she had learned to read as him engaging with something. "Show me the numbers tomorrow," he said. "I think the eastern section could support it, but the water access in dry years is the variable. I would want to check the creek levels in July before committing." "That is exactly the right concern," she said. "We could test it with a small breeding cohort next spring," he said. 15 head, see how the water holds." "That is what I was thinking," she said. He turned his head and looked down at her, and she looked up at him, and they were close in the way that people are close when they have been together long enough that close is simply what they are. "Margaret," he said. "Arthur," she said. "I am glad I stayed," he said, and it was the same economy of expression that good men used for the large things, the same kind of nod, the same kind of brevity that contained everything without requiring volume. "I am glad you stayed," she said. Thomas William, on the porch step below them, had achieved a temporary structural success with his sticks and looked up to show them, and they both looked down at their son with the precise attention of parents who understand that the ordinary moments are the ones that matter, and he said, with the satisfaction of a 3-year-old who has built something, "Look. I see it, Arthur said. "Well done." "Very well done," Margaret agreed. Thomas William returned to his sticks with renewed confidence, and the mesa went from copper to violet to deep blue as the light finished its day, and the first stars appeared over the desert with the same generous extravagance they always did, too many to count, too bright to ignore, and the creek ran on below the house, and the land stretched in every direction, 1,400 acres, hers and built, tended and growing. And the stone and adobe house behind them was warm with the light of the lamps and the sound of Clara Rosa waking from her nap and making the small experimental sounds of a child discovering that she has a voice. And inside that sound was a whole future, a whole continuing, a whole life that was exactly what it was supposed to be. Margaret Alden Yates sat on the porch with her husband in the autumn evening in the New Mexico Territory in the year 1888, and she had her father's land and her mother's intelligence, and her own stubborn clarity and 2 children, and a man who had understood from the first moment that what she needed was not protection but a peer, and who had proven himself to be one completely, and everything that had been unresolved was resolved, and everything that had been open was closed, and everything that had been feared was faced and finished. The stars came out over the mesa one by one and then all at once, the way they always did. The creek ran on. The night was warm and full and entirely, perfectly sufficient.